So I want to just quickly run through this PowerPoint on views. We've been talking about views ever since really the start of last semester with Database Development 1. Mostly I want to get you working towards being able to actually create your own views and work with views with some SQL. It's also helpful to understand exactly how robust they can or can't be in terms of, updating the underlying tables that these views are based on. And we'll take a quick look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of views. So just quickly spinning through this, going all the way back to chapter 1, we first came across the term view, and the definition is in your textbook way back on page 11. It is a virtual relation that does not actually exist in the database, produced upon request at the time of the request. The view or saved query, it doesn't store records in table form. It's really just a saved query that when you run it, or if you run an SQL statement against it, will actually resolve back to those underlying tables and rows and columns in those underlying tables. Creating views we'll look at first, and of course there's your typical syntax statement. What is required is the keywords are the keywords create view. You give it a name, and to take advantage of the data hiding components of views, provide column names, and then of course you require the as whatever that subselect, that underlying statement is that actually builds that virtual table. When you think about views and with regards to database security, where you can actually hide the data, you can hide those underlying table names and column names by creating customized views for users to use day to day. So they have no real understanding of even what the underlying column names are. So of course you're going to want to supply those alias column names or field names when you create your view. Here's an example of a create statement. You've got the create view statement, give it a name, and then there's our underlying subselect. So we've got the branch number, the staff number, and we're actually going to count the number of rows, how many staff at each branch. From staff property for rent, where staff number equals staff number, so there's the join, and because there's an aggregate function, of course we've got to have the group by statement. Dropping a view or deleting a view, you use the drop view command. And there are two options. Restrict is the default, which makes sense because ultimately what restrict means is if you drop the view, if there's any other objects that are dependent on that view, like another view, then the drop will not take place. You can optionally suggest cascade, which would delete anything that takes its definition from that view. Somewhat dangerous approach, though, I would say. Worth taking some time going through the view resolution on this PowerPoint. Get your head wrapped around how these views resolve back to those underlying tables. And this slide actually takes you through step by step how those view fields are resolved back to the underlying tables they select from. Lots of rules around updatability with views. First off, you have to have some knowledge of what the actual underlying tables are, what their keys are, and what their field names are, if you're actually going to go about trying to insert records to an underlying table through a view. That being said, that kind of throws out the window the idea of it being used as a security mechanism. So starting down at the bottom here, you can't have distinct. Every element in the select statement has to be a column name. So in other words, no calculated fields, no aggregated fields. There can only be one table in the from clause, no nested select statements, no group by or having, which ties into the no aggregated. Really, every row added through the view, of course, would have to be in line with any integrity constraints of the underlying table. And there again, if you're updating through a view, then you're not really using that view as a security tool. Ultimately, for the view to be updatable, the database management system has to be able to trace, all of the rows and columns back to those original rows and columns in the original tables that you're drawing from. Certainly the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages. Views are not something you're going to use to automate somebody's task in terms of updating, inserting records into a table. You would ultimately give that user permission to access the table directly for update. And of course there's going to be a performance hit because if you're going through data on a view, every time you view data from the view, it has to resolve back to those underlying tables and the columns and rows in those underlying tables. Lots of great advantages though. The last slide on this is your first look at some syntax for SQL Server. And as I say, I'm going to take a spin through SQL script in Management Studio in the next video, and I'll provide you a sample file that will help you get through Lab 2.